If you are somebody who's interested in getting a PhD, then you've probably heard somebody say, PhDs are fully funded. And the reality is that just might not be as true as everybody would like us to believe. So today we're discussing what does fully funded even mean, and if and how PhD students get into fully funded PhD programs. But before we can answer if PhD programs are really fully funded, we need to first explain what do we even mean by fully funded. When I first heard that PhD programs were fully funded, I assumed that that meant once you accepted your PhD offer, you no longer as a PhD student would have to worry about money, ever. And I imagine a lot of people when they hear fully funded also make this same assumption. So for the purpose of this first portion of this video, when I say fully funded, I mean that you as a graduate student would not have to pay for anything out of pocket. Now, this definition will get a little more complex as the video continues, but for right now, just stick with me. So okay, based off of this definition, for a graduate student to have a fully funded PhD, that would imply the moment that they step onto campus, their tuition, their student fees, their health care, and any other financial miscellaneous needs like rent and childcare or food are all being covered by the university, and they will never have to handle the financial burden. And the way that this is usually done is that the university would develop a funding package that is made up of a mixture of stipends and grants and of course fee remissions that come together that would cover all of these academic costs. So when the student does arrive, they are able to focus on the number one reason that they're even there, which is to execute their research project. But does this ever really happen? I mean, I guess so. Yes, it is completely possible that people do go to a fully funded PhD, and I would not be surprised if you knew somebody who was in fact a graduate student that was fully funded. But does it happen often? Absolutely not. Now, before you panic, I do want to say just because it's not likely, it does not mean that it's impossible. And there are certainly strategies that you can use to secure stipends and grants and funding to work towards a fully funded PhD. And I have a video that talks all about strategies on finding funding for graduate school. Now, with all of that said, the reality is most PhDs are not fully funded. Now, this doesn't mean if you don't have a huge savings account or very rich parents to pay for grad school that you can't pursue being a PhD. That's not true. People do it all the time. And this is where the conversation about fully funded PhDs gets a little tricky. Because technically, right now, I am considered a fully funded PhD student. And after talking to my department, I'm even considered to be one of the most well-funded PhD students in the department, despite the fact that I started my PhD with absolutely no guaranteed funding, and I had to take out student loans my first year, which I highly do not recommend. So then I bet you're wondering, how do I qualify as a fully funded PhD if I don't have the stipends or the grants or the guaranteed fee waivers, and I had to take out student loans in the past? And the reality is, well, I work a lot. And this is where the second definition of a fully funded PhD really comes into play. And this definition is actually what I think most people mean when they say PhDs are fully funded. And here's why. Working as a graduate student, you have the opportunity to be an academic student employee. And usually the benefits that come with being an academic student employee, which could be a teaching assistant or a graduate student researcher or some type of assistantship, is that more times than not, within your job description, you are often receiving fee remission for in-state tuition. Your student health care is often covered. Most, not all, but most of your student fees are also covered. And on top of that, academic student employees receive a stipend, or it functions like a salary. You get paid to do your job. And that stipend or salary is to pay for everything else, which would be rent, food, travel, what have you. But there's a huge problem with calling that fully funded. And the first reason that it's a huge problem to consider this fully funded is that at the end of the day, you went to this institution for one reason and one reason alone, and that is to execute your research project. Work, no matter how closely related it is to your research topic, is still just work, and it functions as a distraction from what you came here to do, which is study. If it was a really fully funded PhD program, then your only priority would be to execute your PhD project. And so anything that exists outside of that to help you go to school is really a distraction. And so for that reason, it can't or it shouldn't be understood as fully funded if you have to work. Not to mention, stipends that you receive as academic student employees are pretty modest, meaning if you only have one job through the university and you're not depending on outside grants or stipends or additional jobs, then you are usually or probably going to be just at the poverty line or slightly above it. And in those instances, it can be really hard to focus on your academics if you don't feel like you can afford rent, pay childcare, feed your family, or any of the other expenses that come with being a PhD student. Also, working as a PhD student also comes with a lot of job insecurity. Most academic student employee positions are contractual, meaning every term you have to renew a contract or discover or secure a new contract. And so you could have a job in the fall term and then have no leads in the spring term and no way to eat, pay rent, or your tuition because you haven't been able to secure a job. So again, there's a lot of insecurity and instability that comes from depending on working to pay for your graduate school. And this doesn't really apply to international or undocumented students. Being an academic student employee is hard enough if you are not a US citizen. Oftentimes there's working caps where you can only work one job or at a certain appointment on your university or even outside of the university. Then on top of that, undocumented students, out-of-state students, international students usually come with additional fees and out-of-state tuition that usually isn't covered by your student employee position. So there's an added amount of financial burden that is compounded with working if you are somebody who is not a resident in the state that you're going to grad school, which is another reason why I wouldn't depend on working as a way to fully fund your PhD, even though that's how I've been doing it. Now, with all that said, yes, some departments do guaranteed jobs and some departments do help cover your out-of-state tuition or your international fees, but it's just good to be aware that just because some do it, all don't. And it's not good practice to depend on your university or depend on your department to help you pay for these expenses. So, are PhD programs fully funded? Well, I guess yes, they can be, but it's definitely not the majority, and more times than not, most students are not fully funded or even partially funded by their graduate institution. And I think we need to be more honest about that reality so less students can make the same mistakes that I did when I was starting my PhD program. So if you're interested in learning more about graduate funding, definitely check out my past videos. And if you want to hear more about grad life, grad advice, and everything research, make sure you subscribe. If you found at least 2 things useful, don't forget to hit thumbs up so other people know that this video has good quality content. And as always, leave any and all of your questions in the comments down below. Your support, your comments, your likes help a small YouTuber like me continue to grow. So thank you so much for your support and engagement, and I will see you next week.